We've got some pretty big breaking news this week about the first ever U.S. sportsbook suspension. With that in mind, I'm calling in reinforcements. No, not you. Find out who on this week's episode of Play USA to Z. I'm Jessica Welman, back again for another dose of gambling news, and this week we have quite a big topic to address. So big, I'm going to have to bring in another face you probably recognize from Q&A Tuesday, Nicole Russo. Nicole answers your questions, but she's also the managing editor of Play10.com and is the perfect person to answer questions about the first ever sports betting license suspension in the country, which happened in Tennessee last week. If you want to keep tabs on me and Nicole, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe using the buttons below. And when we're done talking action, hang around and I will quickly run down some of the biggest headlines from the first week of March Madness betting. All right, guys, like I said, I brought in the reinforcements, and there is truly no one better to appear in this video and talk about this than Nicole Russo, who shares this channel with me. I feel like it's kind of our turf versus everyone else's. She also is the managing editor of Play10.com. And given that she answers your questions every Tuesday, we're just going to have her answer questions on Thursday this time about what on earth is going on in Tennessee with a little app you may not have heard of called Action 24/7. So Nicole, for people who have no idea, what happened last week?
A lot happened last week, but basically a local sports book, and this is a smaller sports book in Tennessee, just to kind of give a rundown. They are, competing with FanDuel and DraftKings and BetMGM. This is a smaller Tennessee-owned and operated sports book, but there was essentially three separate transgressions that took place. One was that somebody under contract with the sports book was involved in proxy betting, which is signing people up for a Tennessee sports betting account when they aren't physically located within the state of Tennessee, and this violates the Wire Act. The second transgression was money laundering. So people were,
to be clear, they didn't money launder.
Correct. Sorry, there were people on using Tennessee Action's platform to facilitate money laundering. Tennessee, the actual business wasn't laundering money, but what happened was a user would create an account in their own name, use a debit card to fund that account with about $10, and that debit card was also in the account holder's name. Once that cleared, they used a multitude of different credit cards in different people's names, debit cards in different people's names to then fund the account, get money on there, and then withdraw that money. And the third transgression is really that in Tennessee, when this is found out by the operator, the regs say that it needs to be reported immediately. They don't give a time frame, but Tennessee Action didn't report it for 8 days, which I think we can all agree is not an immediate reporting. So really three separate transgressions here.
Yeah. And I should note that actually, another reason Nicole is on here and myself, both of us have worked in the regulated gaming space on the operator side before. So some of this stuff that may not seem like a big deal to you guys, we can kind of explain, starting with the money laundering. So let me kind of give my little spiel on this. There's a reason that you see all those old movies like Bugsy and Casino and hear the stories of mobsters running casinos. One, gambling's a good investment. The house always wins. Two, it's a very convenient place to launder money because there are constantly transactions of people giving money and then taking money out again. So when it comes to casinos and regulations in every state, not just Tennessee, sports books, casinos, daily fantasy, they have to be very careful that when money gets on and comes off the site, that money is as clean as they can find it to be. And that leads to what is called AML, or anti-money laundering rules. Nicole, you worked closer with that than I did, and AML stuff. Just in general, what kind of stuff does that entail?
Yeah, so essentially on the operator side, we want to make sure that obviously the money that's coming in is from the account holders, bank or PayPal or whatever method they're using to fund it, but also that the money and this is not being on the sportsbook's not being used to just hold the money, right? This is not a bank. You can't just let the money sit there and basically go unaudited and then try to pull it out later. So if you're putting money on the site, it needs to be wagered with. So from an operator standpoint, two things really should have occurred. First, as soon as a transaction happened that wasn't in that account holder's name, that account should have been flagged, and really no further transaction should have been happening on that account until the fraud team or the AML team reached out. And number two, if the money was being put onto the account and then immediately trying to be withdrawn, that also should have initiated an anti-money laundering check, which it seems like that was not the case with Action. So really all of those internal controls that every other operator has in place to flag those accounts and shut them down were not in place with Action.
Yeah, so they flagged them and shut them down within like a day or two, they're claiming. What's different between that is, they did let some of these transactions go through, and the end goal in a regulated space is to not let any of these transactions happen in the first place. So again, if you're hearing, well, they caught it, yes, they did, but it shouldn't have ever happened given the standards and the regulations in place in Tennessee, right?
Correct. Yeah. So as soon as that first, from my previous experience with an operator, as soon as that first transaction was made with an account that wasn't in the account holder's name, that should have done an immediate, like not within 15 seconds, that account should have been completely shut down and no further transactions should have been able to happen. I think that yes, while Tennessee did catch some, there was one account in particular where I believe over 100 transactions went through, and that's a huge red flag. So after that first one, that account should have been completely shut down. There should have been no further ability to make a transaction. So that's where the issue really stems from.
Yeah. So to kind of put a pin in the money laundering thing, I do have a couple other points I want to make, and then we'll get going to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, because there's so much to unpack here. Reading through the lawsuit, so Action got its license suspended last Friday, or actually technically last Thursday evening. The Tennessee Lottery held a meeting of its executive board and took a vote and confirmed that suspension on Friday, and they have been suspended ever since. On Tuesday, they filed a suit in court, Act 24/7, against the lottery to get that suspension lifted, saying that there wasn't due process in the order that things happened for the suspension. And we'll get to that in a second. But I read that lawsuit today. A couple of things stood out as interesting. In Action's banking system, they said that the financial company they use, I believe, is PaySafe, their third-party vendor, does not track the name on the account of the cards that they're accepting deposits from. So, and they said it was traditional financial banking institution practices to not necessarily have those names, when you're hearing us say that in other operators, they in fact do have that information and it's important. The other piece of this is that, in fact, Action 24/7, as Nicole also aptly pointed out, is in fact more like Action 16/7, because during the evening hours, they weren't doing this tracking because they just didn't have that many deposits. And retroactively, once they saw those deposits were happening, put in round the clock stuff. It's par for the course that these things would have been in place at any other regulated operator. So that's the money laundering piece of it. They weren't money laundering, but because these things weren't in place in advance of this, that's where the issue is. The proxy betting stuff is weird because nobody seems to be talking about it, right?
Yeah, I think it was kind of mentioned one time in a meeting, and I think when we heard it, our like antennas went straight up. And it seems like this has not been an issue for many people, but when it comes to just the state of regulated online sports betting throughout the US, like a violation of the Federal Wire Act is massive.
And so yeah, proxy betting, they facilitated these accounts, and then they have someone in Tennessee place those bets for them. In theory, I could call up my sister in Tennessee and be like, hey, put 500 on the Titans for me. And that is technically a violation of the law. It is, especially when you are the operator and you know that you're not supposed to be taking bets across. The Wire Act is in fact a telephone line thing. So if you call them, that's part of it. We heard about it a little in a meeting shortly after the Super Bowl because the lottery board did mention that there were actually two sites with suspicious activity. It sounds like maybe Action wasn't the only proxy bettor there, and maybe this was where they got a slap on the wrist. It's kind of murky and hard to tell exactly how that situation was handled.
Yeah, it's really hard to tell. First, we don't know who the other operator is. We don't know how many accounts were with the other operator and when they caught it. I think the thing that was most jarring to hear was that somebody under contract with the actual sports book was the one facilitating the proxy betting. I think it would be remiss to say that like this does not happen with friends and family across,
Yeah,
state
no one's
lines.
gonna prosecute me for, telling my sister I'll give you 10% if you put a bet in Tennessee. Still
Right.
don't
We
do it.
know we know that there is likely a lot of people that do this. I mean, we are very familiar with the Vegas market. We know this happens. But I think the bigger issue is that when somebody gets that stamp of approval as a regulated operator, I mean, that is a sign of trust in that state. We've said it so many times. It's regulated, it's audited, it's trustworthy. And here you have them doing essentially what an offshore book does. And
Yeah.
it's not making them much better than an offshore entity. So I think that's where the concern comes from. We love sports betting so much and we want to see it grow, but things like this can really hamper that in other
Yeah.
states.
And to give you some context of the Tennessee lottery, Tennessee is a state where there's not really much gambling beyond the lottery, and there's not even horse racing in Tennessee. It's basically just the lottery. So this is the group that ended up regulating sports betting. They formed a sports betting committee. Most of the people on that committee are either not related to sports betting at all or very tangentially related in the sense that there's a member who works for the Grizzlies. There's not a lot of institutional knowledge at the Tennessee Lottery about running a sports book. So it is, as it is in many states, a big learning curve. It just seems that this one is a little steeper and bumpier than everyone else's.
And I think the comparison that we've made a few times is that if we were to have seen these transgressions happen in a more mature market like Nevada with the Gaming Control Board or in New Jersey with the DGE, the conversation of possibly reinstating this sports book would not even be on the table, in my opinion. And the fines would be so high that likely a local sports book like this would not be able to survive the consequences. But the reaction to the transgressions has just been very lax, in my personal opinion.
Yeah. This also, to put the big allegedly on it, we have not heard much beyond the lawsuit about Action 24/7's point of view of things. They take a lot of objection to Daniel Dorenzo, who was the investigator at Tennessee Lottery, who spoke at the meeting where they got the vote to suspend done with the board. And, he admitted, I looked at 3 or 4 of 23 accounts, and based on that, I seen enough alarming evidence in my 22 years in the Secret Service to tell the lottery to pull the plug. We haven't heard from them. They contend that they caught these issues very quickly. They immediately put measures in and that they're not being given a fair shake. And they actually asked to speak at the meeting on Friday, but the Tennessee Lottery has a policy on these meetings that outside speakers can't talk unless they're asking a question. It is a little weird though that they didn't. You would think that for this you would amend your rules a little. I would want to hear from them if I was the board and I'm hearing only the investigator, but that's just me.
Yeah, I've been pretty harsh on Action 24/7 to give them kind of, a different scope. I will agree with them that in that meeting, there was a lot of people that had not seen the documentation that Action 24/7 had provided. So only a handful of the board members had actually seen the affidavits or the response to these issues. Most of them were in their cars or on spring break.
Yeah.
So I will say that I will agree with Action that this meeting was pretty much haphazardly thrown together and people did seem very confused. I think they were trying to err on the side of caution with, what the investigator was saying, but I do also see Action's point that this kind of came at a bad time with it, being March Madness and all, but it's a tough decision to make and I think they were as you pointed out, relying on the investigator, because there just truly aren't a lot of people on that advisory committee that have a ton of knowledge in the sports betting world.
Yeah, you have to be in gaming for quite a while to even know about these processes that we're talking about. I do not possess the ability to look at financial documents and decide what is and isn't money laundering. So, I can't speak to that. I am impressed with this guy's credentials, so I don't have any reason not to believe him. But yeah, the meeting itself is kind of why this lawsuit's happening, because in the regs, it pretty clearly states that if the board finds reasonable evidence to believe that, say, Action 24/7 misrepresented their internal controls, and I believe Daniel Dorenzo said he found it highly, highly likely. There may have been 3 or 4 more highlies in there. He was just very clear that based on what Action 24/7 told them they had done, they seemed to be lying or misrepresenting, at least, what their internal controls were. For that reason alone, they actually have the grounds to suspend the license. The problem is the order of events that happened. So the site came down on Thursday night of last week, just before March Madness, yet the meeting with the vote of the board, who are the people that can make this happen, didn't happen until 2 p.m. the next day. So that's kind of the heart of the lawsuit. The other piece of the lawsuit is just due process and them being able to present their case and everything. But, they also I think they'll probably seek some sort of damages for being down during the first 4 days of March Madness. It was pretty funny to, at least as an outsider and not a Vols fan, to watch the Vols lose in the first round after many people had them as like a Final Four team, and then they were gone and actually couldn't really take any action on it.
Yeah, it was the timing was not great, but I think that even the board had kind of said, hey, you found this out on March 8th or 9th. If you would have come to us on March 8th or 9th, you probably could have been up and running by March Madness. So I do understand that, Action was upset with the timing, but they do have to take some responsibility on that because they did not immediately report. And I think had they immediately reported what was happening, the board, who we've seen really wants to get them back up and running, I think would have tried everything in their power to get them back up and running for March Madness.
That's another interesting wrinkle to this. As regulators, I've watched many a regulatory meeting where people will be very strict when they are handing down fines and punishments and things like that. We won't know if there are any fines of this until like a full audit of all 23 of those accounts are done and they know how many incidents took place that were monitored and weren't and everything. But the thought is there will be a fine eventually. A funny wrinkle of this is that the lottery board is actually really sympathetic to Action and does want them to be reinstated. And there may be a fine down the road, given they need to fully audit everything. Most regulators, when they're laying down penalties or suspending a license, use much stronger language than what Tennessee Lottery was using. When Cantor Gaming had a couple issues with Nevada regulators a couple of years ago, the regulators were pretty hardcore in taking them down. The attitude of the lottery board was, well, you're the local guy and we're rooting for you and we would hate to kill a local business, but we also kind of have to do this. It's an interesting wrinkle to this that, I think you and I, more than anybody, are just like, really? This is the tone you're going for?
Yeah, it's been a very sympathetic tone, I think, from everyone besides DiRienzo, because, and I do think it's fair. I mean, the lawsuit is pretty upset with him and his language regarding them, but I do think it's fair to point out that he was already working with them internally when the first transgression happened to get some of these internal controls in place.
Yeah.
And internally, he was seeing that there were a lot of issues. So I think when the second issue happened, he was at the point where enough is enough. And
Yeah,
he
was
kind
the
of
one guy who was like, I offered my help. We tried to help you. We tried this, and here you are. So I'm done.
It's a little good cop, bad cop that's going
Yeah,
on
maybe
right
that's
now.
it. He's the bad cop and they're the good cop. Perhaps that's their whole approach. All right, we've gone into deep detail on this kind of on an industry perspective. For people that have an Action 24/7 account, it's frozen. What can they do right now?
Yeah, so that situation's been a little messy because when you open up the Action app, you are going to see a screen that says, sorry, we're unavailable. So, that's how you access the cashier is through the app or through the website. And there really wasn't a lot of clarity on how these people could get their money back. And then you want that money back to bet on March Madness. We did talk to a representative with the lottery that said that Action has been approved to allow withdrawals under certain circumstances. We aren't sure exactly what those circumstances are, but that you will need to call them or contact them directly in order to ask about the withdrawal.
Yeah, and I went on a little goose chase yesterday, called Action, asked about withdrawals. They said they couldn't comment, emailed their contact line, and haven't gotten a response yet. And even went so far as to call Advance Financial, their payday loan sister company, who can take deposits on Action 24/7 to see if maybe if someone went into there, they could get their money back, and they weren't allowed to comment either. So for now, it seems that even though they have the okay to withdraw, it may be that they lack the ability to implement that technologically, which wouldn't be surprising given we just spent 15 minutes talking about their lack of technological stuff being in play, or they just aren't going to do that until this matter is resolved. So if you are a customer, keep tuning in to play10.com because you guys are on top of all of this, right?
Yeah, so we're following it. I mean, really, you can wait it out if you want to keep your money on the site. I wouldn't personally recommend it at this point. Or I would say contact them. I think if you can provide an account number,
Yeah, it sounds
hopefully
like
they will be able to help you make that withdrawal. But yeah, we're up to date on it. We just posted a story this morning about the lawsuit. So everything that comes in, we are covering it over at Play 10.
Yep. And by the time you watch this, we actually should have results from Wednesday's court proceedings on this lawsuit. So once you're done watching this, just hop on over to play10.com and find out the rest. All right. Thanks, Nicole, for the big explanation. And hopefully you guys have a better understanding of why this is a bigger deal than maybe you think it is.
Thanks.
All right. Now that I have calmed down, time to get mad all over again with a quick rundown of some of the top headlines of the week related to my favorite sporting event of the year, March Madness. I am going to put a shot clock on myself, though, and we're going to keep it brief. Now, let's go. Judge Jessica may have to revisit whether Virginia or Illinois has it worse because Illinois bettors had to be livid they couldn't take part in Loyola Chicago's upset of top-seeded Illinois. Plus, the Loyola Sister Jeans are favored to advance to the Elite Eight next weekend. And yes, I changed their mascot to its more deserving owner. Meanwhile, one Virginia team, Virginia Commonwealth, had a positive COVID-19 test, and as a result, they had to forfeit their opening round match to Oregon. If you had a bet on VCU or Oregon, most sports books did rule the bet as no action and refunded your wagers. Speaking of Oregon, it also has an in-state betting ban, and it has not one but two schools they can't bet on after the massive performance by the Pac-12 in the first two rounds of action. The Sweet 16 is 25% Pac-12 with USC, Fight On, UCLA, Boo, Oregon State, and Oregon. Finally, if you spent all weekend watching basketball, you probably spent a good chunk of time watching NBA on TNT panelist Kenny Smith shill things. Given that he is in current commercial spots for Wendy's, Corona Beer, and BetMGM, plus he has a newly signed sponsorship deal with FanDuel, Play Colorado's Ian St. Clair has a really fun story at that site about how maybe we should be regulating Kenny commercials in addition to sports betting spots. Oop, there's the buzzer. That's my time. In the meantime, I'll see you next time on Play USA to Z.